Hey, everybody. Whoa. Man, come on now. We're here to talk about the cloud. Actually, before we get into it, Pat, you just came back from a really amazing trip, and could you share it with everybody since we're here in the mountains?
Sure. So I came down from 20,000 feet, just climbing Kilimanjaro last week. So I was up at 19,341 feet, right? Bunch of VMware folk and fund. Yeah, no problem. So this is low, and fundraising for slum to develop and schools for slum kids in Nairobi. We have over 16,000 kids in the schools now, and this was fundraising specifically to bring girls into high schools.
Yeah, it's absolutely impressive, and yeah, please. I mean, come on. And the reason I bring it up is because Pat was showing me photos backstage of what it looks like from the top, which, by the way, I don't think I have the constitution to get up there, so
I think you make it. I think you make it.
And he's actually above the clouds, which is just unbelievable. And I just found it very appropriate for this session. So let's just dive right in, shall we? I was reading an article recently that said the importance of cloud computing is almost impossible to overstate. And gotta love a proclamation like that about technology. And in truth, you heard Brian's statement about how big the market was last year, and I actually have a stat to follow up with that. It was the global public cloud services market will be, in 2 years from now, $411 billion. So, nice chunk of change, I think. So there's a lot of room to move, kind of like what Dara was talking about earlier with the scooters. And my goal with this session is to understand how companies are really riding the wave. So first off, maybe Pat, if you'd like to start, what are we seeing here? How are businesses dealing with the cloud market? I feel like we've been talking about cloud computing for more than a decade now, I think. I mean, the terminology has
about
changed.
a decade, yeah.
What's going on right now? What are businesses doing? And how are you reacting to it?
Well, clearly we've seen this shift where people used to view it, particularly enterprises, where, boy, I'm not ready to go there. Now everybody is going there. And about 4 or 5 years ago, we talked about hybrid cloud, right? Public and private cloud working together. And when we talked about it, people said we were nuts. Now everybody's doing it, right? Realizing what I call the 3 laws. The laws of physics, not everything can go there, right? The laws of economics, right? The cost of it, and finally, the laws of the land. And because of that, you saw this public-private coming together, hybrid cloud. Everybody now sees that as a necessity. But as we look to the next phase of it, I'm describing what I call the quad cloud era, where it's public, private, telco clouds, and edge or IoT environments as well. And those 4 interoperating, and again, those 3 laws driving more edge-based computing, right? And there's going to be infrastructure to support it. Telco, as we move to 5G and NFV environments, those are proper clouds as well, and how those are going to connect with each other. And then, of course, the massive public clouds, and there's going to be a lot of private clouds. We're not even halfway there yet. So we have a long way to go, and we see this multi-cloud era in front of us.
And I mean, that was a lot of clouds, first off. Can we acknowledge? It's my understanding that hybrid is kind of waning a little bit in favor of this multi-cloud thing. Is that accurate?
I think it's actually evolving into this multi-cloud world, where now actually we do have this ability, this agility to move workloads from private to public. And boy, the regulatory environments might be driving things back on premise. What's going to happen with GDPR in Europe, where all of a sudden things say, I got to go from global public clouds to local Swiss clouds or German clouds, or sometimes back on premise. And that environment is now maturing, that people can put the right workloads, the right data at the right places to meet the 3 laws.
Sounds like the World Cup of cloud computing. So I would like to talk a little, get our heads out of the clouds. Man, they're just going to keep coming. And really focus on kind of what businesses are doing, what industries and so forth. What are we seeing? I'm understanding that there's a big embrace by health companies, finance companies, and Lisa, actually, you might want to weigh in on cryptocurrency and how that's impacting that kind of thing, maybe entertainment, automotive. What are we seeing here? Lisa, please, if you could, that's driving business now?
Well, I'll just make a couple of comments, just building off of what Pat said. I think the amazing thing about the cloud is there really is no one size fits all, right? I mean, there's so many different use cases And actually, you need different clouds for each one of those use cases, whether you're talking about private or public or telco or others. And so, in finance, you have a certain set of use cases, and you'll design your environment around that. In entertainment, gaming is really, really big right now, and you can see that in, what's happening in the cloud with cloud gaming and what's happening with esports and all of that. That has its set of use cases. And blockchain is another set of use cases. And so I think that's what's so exciting about the cloud. You started, Andrew, with the fact that we've been talking about cloud computing for the last 10 years, and is it getting sort of to be old hat? I think the three of us might say that the next 10 years will be more exciting than the last 10 because there are just so many new workloads that, and for us, we can innovate on those new workloads.
I mean, one of the things to pick up on that we find quite interesting is how global the opportunity is. So for Dropbox, we have over 500 million users of our product, over 300,000 paying teams, and 80% of those users are outside the US. And that's been true from a very early stage in the company. When we look at our growth is increasingly going to be from outside the US. And it's really the same kinds of workloads that you see in the US that are just being replicated elsewhere. Things like GDPR add complication, but we really think we're at the early stages of a pretty large global opportunity.
Are we seeing, actually, Lisa, I'd like to come back to you for a second. So you sell chips. And you can really see who's buying, and you've got data centers and certainly special uses for that. Gaming, you mentioned one of them. Where do you see big growth areas that are obviously playing into this broader cloud theme?
Well, yeah, certainly. So, from the chip standpoint, we're really at sort of the very early stages of the cloud build out. And certainly you see, the large, big public clouds driving a lot of the compute, whether it's an Amazon or Google or these guys. But I think you also see, a tremendous amount of, let's call it medium-sized companies thinking about how to do the next big thing. I mean, certainly what Dennis and the team have done at Dropbox, true innovation, allows you to kind of take, for us, it's about, how do we use technology to solve problems? And so, so I view, there is a lot of growth in, sort of the large public clouds, but I think, also you see, quite a bit of innovation happening in sort of more medium-sized companies that are looking for, what is that next value add that you can add, to the industry.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about centralization. As this market has grown, the market shares of some of the companies that Brian mentioned at the top of this, they're getting kind of impressive, and yet it's a nascent market, according to you three, right? So are we concerned about too much centralization, too much power in the hands of too few technology companies or otherwise?
Well, I think there's both a technical centralization and a business or economic centralization. In fact, this is year 38 for me in the tech industry, and we've seen this pendulum of centralization and decentralization over time. Clearly, cloud has been a force of centralization, and I think edge and IoT will be a force of decentralization, where more infrastructure will get put closer to where data, where robotics, where the smart streets are. So we're going to see that technological distribution reoccurring. Clearly, in terms of the economic sense or the political sense, it has been also the tech companies have emerged. And frankly, I expect that we're in for at least a decade where tech continues to be very strong. Tech is permeating every aspect of every business. And as a result, tech is well outgrowing the economies overall. I expect that to continue. Obviously there's governments, regulatory effects, all sorts of other things like that. But a well-positioned tech company, you're going to have a good decade in front of you. Go for it.
Yeah. I think from an end user standpoint, it's actually a lot more competitive than it was 10 years ago when most people were using a Windows device to get all of their work done. With Android, iOS, Windows, that actually creates opportunities for companies like Dropbox. You heard from Slack earlier. There's a whole slew of companies that really have just gotten to billion-dollar scale in the last year, or last couple of years, that are solving problems that the larger companies can't solve because they're inherently cross-platform. So although, yeah, you have these big players, there's still a lot of room.
And some of the companies you just mentioned, and you touched on it in another comment, you're talking about a big change in a business model, right? I think that's what's most interesting and compelling. Do you find that there are more opportunities, particularly strong ones, moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think one of the big changes is every person has a million applications in their pocket, and they can bring to work what is going to help them get their job done better. And if that's Dropbox, then they bring us to work. So instead of relying on large-scale sales forces that are expensive, that take time to scale, that typically are country-specific, companies with a good product can reach a global market incredibly quickly and get to scale. And then with the help of partners, can scale up the infrastructure to support that business.
Yeah. I think that's the key. I mean, every business can benefit from using the cloud in certain applications, from bringing different partners together, because there is just so many different capabilities. And I think that's sort of what's different back to your centralization versus decentralization. Yes, there are these big players, but frankly, they're enablers for a whole bunch of let's call it smart people to come up with new applications that do things better.
Yeah, we just had JD.com and that market, but think about how many markets in the world are yet to be transformed.
Right.
I was just in Kenya this week as part of my big climb and meet with Humudu, right, who is transforming government in Kenya. And not only is it transforming, bringing e-government services all the way to the individual, but it eliminates all of this opportunity for graft and corruption, right, which is transforming those society, bringing basic services to farmers, just having crop availability and weather availability, market availability. Boy, we have yet half the planet that literally hasn't been touched yet by mobility and the internet. We have a long, long way to go.
Right. Now, you mentioned corruption. Earlier we were talking about GDPR. One of the things I think about as the cloud becomes, swallows up everything, really, is trust and security. So let's talk about that a little bit. Doesn't all this interconnectivity make that risk higher? I mean, I recall when the cloud became a term that we started using, everybody was, all the CIOs were terrified, right? They were like, I'm not going to put my stuff in the cloud. No way, no way. And of course, that's changed, and there's been a middle ground, hybrid. But what are we doing about security now? I mean, Lisa, there's been a lot of chip challenges this year, haven't there?
It's been an interesting year for security and hardware. No, look, I think it's a really important point, a really, really important point. I think there's an incredible responsibility that we have as part of the ecosystem, whether you're a hardware provider or a software provider or a services provider, to provide a really secure environment. And security has always been important, but now it's like sort of top of mind in terms of how do you design products, how do you work together with our ecosystem partners to get there. And I have no doubt that we can make it a tremendously more secure environment. But it takes work and it takes partnership to do that.
Can we do it financially sustainably?
Oh, absolutely, without a doubt. I mean, when we think about sort of what smart engineers can do, I mean, we're putting all kinds of new hooks into our hardware such that you can say you have hardware-based security even if you're sitting in the cloud. So it can absolutely be done. It's just focusing the ecosystem on that problem.
Sure.
I was with the CIO of one of the big 5 banks, and I asked him, how many server vendors do you have? And he said 2. How many storage vendors do you have? 2. How many networking vendors do you have? Wireless campus, I think it's 4. How many security vendors do you have? 250. Right, it's just nuts. Right, this is, again, this is one of the top 5 bank CIOs in the world. Fundamentally, we have allowed security to be much too hard. It's bolted on. It must become intrinsic in the infrastructure, and we have to make that 250 become 20 as we go forward, building inherent intrinsic security into the platform. Furthermore, as more and more of the economy and society comes online, we as a tech industry need to be far more engaged in shaping public policy, government regulations, et cetera. It's our responsibility to make that trip to Washington, spend the time educating, participating in the formation of laws, because otherwise, people who really don't understand the technology are going to be doing it on our behalf. We must be engaging in a proactive, positive, and effective way.
Sure. Dennis, you compete with some of the biggest tech companies. In fact, I think Brian had mentioned some of them on our way out. And you really do, because you have your own infrastructure, right? How do you feel about this conversation? Do you feel like you can be a part of the lawmaking? Do you feel like you have enough resources to really fight side by side, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in conversations with policymakers, they're interested in the viewpoints of the larger companies, but they're also interested in innovation and the viewpoints of companies that are trying to build the next big thing. So we find actually that our voice is heard, and we also frequently join in with others in our industry around some of the issues that you've been talking about. So I think there's, but I agree with what Pat and Lisa said. There is a need for more engagement on behalf of our industry.
Yeah, yeah. There are a lot of things driving this explosion of cloud. We mentioned some of them already. Internet of Things, right? 5G and mobile, which is been going on for quite a while, and of course artificial intelligence, which we haven't really touched on yet. What do you think is most powerfully driving this overall trend?
Well, I've called it the 4 superpowers.
Sure.
Cloud, mobility, AI, and IoT. And those 4 coming together are actually reinforcing each other.
Okay.
30 years ago when I was architecting the 486, my marketing manager came running into my office and he said, "You must make the 486 a great AI chip." This is 1986. Thinking machines, Lisp, Prolog, the foundations were being laid. Right, what happened? Nothing. And now we have AI as a 30-year overnight success, right? Because cloud allows it to have so much computing. Mobility is bringing so much data. IoT, all of these are reinforcing each other. So what we're seeing is these superpowers are in fact accelerating each other. And that's what makes this such a stunning time for the evolution of the technology history. Each one of these is making the other 3 even better. We view those 4 as the superpowers. Cloud, unlimited scale. Sure. Mobility, unlimited reach. AI bringing intelligence to everything, and IoT bridging the physical and digital world. It's a wonderful time.
Lisa, do you feel that they're on equal footing?
Yeah, maybe I'll just add to what Pat said, and I'll say it, sort of in our world. I think the thing that's different about today than maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago is we just have an incredible amount of data. I mean, it's just an incredible amount of data. We each personally generate data, our companies generate data, we track data, we have all this stuff. And the truth is, we don't know what to do with all that data. And so I think the power of, when you think about, as businesses, what you can do, if you can really mobilize, what do you do with all that information? And how do you, use it to make better decisions, to make better products, to help solve the world's hardest problems? I think that's what powers the cloud going forward. And many of the, whether you're talking about IoT or you're talking about artificial intelligence, I mean, it's incredible how early we are in the days of truly making computing smart. Like, computing is not smart enough yet, and we have a tremendous amount of innovation to go over the next 5 to 10 years to basically take advantage of all of this data that we're generating.
Yeah, computing is not smart enough. I like that. Tweet that. Dennis, what's driving your international growth?
Well, I'd say it's the same thing that's driving our global business. There's still a massive migration of data, content from a fairly fragmented set of local systems to cloud. So if you think about your small business that in the past would rely on a file server or would rely on a hard drive on someone's desk to store the most important information in that organization, most small businesses now are comfortable with cloud. They're going to move all that information to cloud. Then it's accessible to for multiple devices, for multiple people. And we've spent the last 11 years building up a database of about over an exabyte of content. And there's a lot of signal in that content that we're really just discovering now. So we understand file type, we understand who you share with, what kinds of organizations you're sharing with, what you're trying to do, which allows us to add value to that content over time. And the idea is that if your content's in Dropbox, it's smarter than if it's resident locally. So we're still seeing this massive shift from fragmented local systems to cloud that's driving our business globally, and that's truly a global trend combined with more and more trust of cloud.
Yeah. Hurdles? Hurdles?
I mean, some countries are slower adopting than others, which is natural in the technology curve. There are regulatory schemes that are more or less friendly to cloud than in different parts of the world. So, and every government is grappling with issues of privacy, issues of data security, and they're not all coming at the problem with the same mindset, and they're often coming at the problem with conflicting mindsets, which makes it hard to know what to do all the time. But those are the primary barriers that we see.
I do think that GDPR is going to set a global baseline, and every in the world will either measure themselves above or below that baseline in setting, I'll say, data privacy requirements, a legal framework associated with it. And I fully expect that after a few good lawsuits in Europe, everybody in the world will have some sort of view of where they fit with that. And I think many of that will resolve a number of the issues that Dennis is describing.
Yeah. I'm going to come to the audience in a second for questions, so please prepare some. Speaking of hurdles, I want to talk about, kind of the elephant in the room for you, sir, which is that, well, you might have just avoided one. You tell me. Of course, Dell just recently decided to not completely consume you, but purchase the tracking stock. And it's kind of put you in an interesting position, but you've been pretty positive about it. Could you please elaborate on how that impacts your...
Yeah, and how does this pertain to cloud?
Tell me.
Anyway, so obviously the Dell announcement of going public, right, merging with the tracking stock, the continued and long-term independence of VMware, a very good outcome. An $11 billion special dividend, so everybody's sort of happy who's a shareholder. And if you were participating in a DVMT or VMware, right, from the time of the merger, you're anywhere from 3 to 4x of the market cap. So everybody is pretty happy with this. And ultimately, as the VMware leader, Dell has been a huge accelerant to our growth. Our strategy is resonating. We've seen market responding to our private cloud, our public cloud, our end-user computing business, and Dell is accelerating across all of those. And we continue to have a great independent board, a great independent ecosystem, and Michael's cheering us on.
All right, fair enough. Questions? Yes. Toward the back there. Yes, thank you.
Hi, Michael Miller. Mostly for Pat and Lisa. Because you're chip guys, over the last...
I run a software company now.
Yes, but you know about this stuff. Over the last, 40, 50, 70 years, what's really driven the industry in part has been Moore's Law and how it's, transformed all of these things that we now have possible or because of that. There's lately been a lot of talk that Moore's Law is slowing down and we're reaching physical limits on things. And my question for the two of you, and for Dennis if he wants to answer it as well, is this something we as an industry should be thinking about, not for the short term, but over the next 5, 10, 15 years, about what's happening with the slowdown in transistor scaling?
Yeah, so good question. I get asked it often. I think it's absolutely true that Moore's Law is slowing down. I think you could have seen that a couple of years ago. But what I would say, it's our job as the hardware providers to continue to provide innovation and sort of that increase in performance and capability, even though Moore's Law is slowing down. And how do we do that? We do that in architecture. We do that in using different chip solutions for the various things. So you'll see that GPU compute has become a very, very large growth driver because, frankly, it's great for AI and machine learning applications. So there are a lot of tricks of the trade that I would say from a silicon standpoint. Our job is to make sure the foundation is there, even though that Moore's Law is slowing down. And frankly, I think it's actually good because it allows companies to focus on what are the next big things, and the next big things really being around architecture and how can we solve a different set of problems. It's not just faster and cheaper is better, but there's actually some nuance in how you solve these different problems.
A few additional points to add to what Lisa said. My rule of thumb, Moore's Law was always a doubling every 2 years. It's more like a doubling every 3 years now, right? So as that slope is flattened, and it continues as we get to 7 nanometers and beyond. So it's not like it's dead yet by any means, but it has slowed. The architectural comment's an important one in the sense that now GPUs are in many respects replacing CPUs as the center of the most interesting workloads around AI and ML. We're about to see a whole raft of new machine architectures that are optimized toward AI and ML workloads as well, graph workloads, neural networks, other things like that. Third comment would be is that hardware innovations are still happening, and things like persistent memory, right? At this point, if you gave me persistent memory, I can deal with a whole set of different aspects of computing algorithms that weren't possible before because of multi-stages, of rotating media, of distant over network things. We'll probably see the first practical quantum computing in the next 5 to 10 years as well, which changes the entire binary model of computing for the first time. Last comment would be is that cloud computing by its very nature is distributed computing. Right? So in that sense, the fact that Moore's law of any individual core, right, isn't increasing at the rate that it used to, the power of cloud computing is I can essentially scale up to hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of cores operating on parallel distributed problems. So computing is in no way a limitation, nor Moore's law a limitation for architectural and algorithmic innovation.
There you go. You got them to talk about chips. All right, last question right back there.
Although you're a software guy.
As a distributed computing, it's all.
Pat, this is Adam Lashinsky with Fortune, and that's exactly, Lisa, what I want to ask Pat about. I know when the Intel CEO position came open, you professed your love of software and VMware. But we've all been listening to you speak eloquently just now about Moore's law and nanometers and architecture and so on. So my question to you is, if the Intel board invited you to apply for the job of CEO, would you decline their invitation?
I would send them Lisa's name.
But would you decline their invitation to apply for the job?
I'm very happy running VMware and the futures of software.
What does that have to do with cloud computing?
I think they violate their own rules
I
here.
see,
This
I
Fortune
see.
stuff, it's hard to manage.
Well, with that said, please, a round of applause for my panelists.